Thank you so much, everybody, for the opportunity. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. And I hope good morning for folks in the Pacific Coast, good afternoon for folks in the East Coast. Um, I hope this is going to be worth your time. But one of the things that I definitely want to make sure, and I'm trying to be provocative in my title for that. I want to be fair, right? So I definitely will be talking mostly about the GCP announcements because this is a whole Google Cloud sort of like event. There's all sorts of announcements in the world of generative AI on Vertex, which is our umbrella for all things AI within the Google Cloud platform. And I want to talk about like all the Google sensational stuff that's coming out, right? However, I do want to be fair. And that's why I want to invite you all to ask questions, ask for comparisons, ask for. I've been dealing a little background on me to put this into perspective, right? I've been at Google for around 6 years, which coincides right around the time when Google published the Transformer paper, which is now pre-pandemic. Google publishing the Transformer paper seems like a lifetime ago. Like so much has changed in the world ever since then, right? Um, and it's a little bit bizarre in my like in the way that I have been a part of this journey is a little bit bizarre how the world of generative AI has sort of like exploded into common knowledge and into like the public, right? And it seemed to have happened, like in my opinion, it almost like happened overnight, right? So to put it in perspective, in 2022, uh it was around maybe October, November. So it's been around 2 years since ChatGPT went viral, right? Like the app went viral. And before that, so like before that time frame, which is almost like exactly 2 years ago, we had several groups, engineers, and people doing like side projects using generative AI, but it wasn't there wasn't any hype. That was just the main thing, right? So there wasn't any it wasn't something that everybody was talking about. So in the beginning of 2022, for example, we were working in the education sector, and we had something that we call the AI tutor. And in fact, it was like we had been working on that for a few years. Walden University published a demo in 2021 using this AI tutor, and that video is still out there, which is funny because like that tutor was very similar to what people's experience was with ChatGPT. It was a chatbot who used colloquial language and who could interact via natural language and would be able to like answer questions to students, right? um, but the way that this was being done was super like manual and hacking things together, like a lot of like spaghetti code to get a BERT and a T5 model into. We didn't have like any of the fancy ML ops, even though it was just 2 years ago. We didn't have any of the fancy ML ops that was created after all the hype around GenAI. So much has changed in the last 2 years, even though in some ways the technology has existed for longer than that. Does that make sense? So that's the whole thing that's like a little bit bizarre to me in some ways. It's just like how much this has in some ways evolved, but also in some ways how much this has devolved because of all of the hype and because now this is all public, right? And now there's so much money being put into all of this. This is sort of like a crazy world now in which we have companies like Google, which would publish these research as white papers, and we're not doing that anymore. You have companies like OpenAI that started out as a nonprofit that was supposed to be open and supposed to be sort of like abstracted from the tech giants, and that's not the case anymore. And we have players like Zuckerberg now, who's like, even though Llama is open source, he's hoarding all of the H100 GPUs in the world to like train the new versions of Llama. So it's such an interesting, like it's almost like a conflicting world in some ways, right? If in some ways, like there is an aspect of open source which all of these companies had in their DNA, OpenAI, Meta, Google, that of making these technologies open. but there's also a trend because of like so much money that's involved and so much hype that's happening. There's also this trend of now keeping things under wraps and keeping things in a black box, which is also part of the nature of a model. A model, any machine learning model, not just a generative AI model, but any machine learning model is a little bit of a black box, because it's hard to reverse engineer a model compared to other traditional software that follows more heuristical approaches. Machine learning is like this crazy sponge that just absorbs things, and then once it absorbs and knows things, it's difficult to like let me make a copy of that kind of thing, or let me just like program something that does the same thing. It's not that simple. You would have to train that model the same way that the previous model was trained, um, or deploy an endpoint of the same model, which would have proprietary implications to that. Anyway, so because there's so much like going on in the world right now with this, that's why I want to keep the discussion as fair as possible. I don't want this to sound just like, oh, there's like a Google guy here and he's telling us that all of the Google stuff is the best, and that Google, it's like I definitely want to make it fair. And one of the things that I have been seeing, so in the past 2 years, before the hype, right, we were working with generative AI, but it was a thing that nobody was. It wasn't top of mind for any of my clients or people who are using GCP and spending money on GCP. After the after that explosion on generative AI, or pretty much the last 2 years exactly, um, all of the customer facing folks that are helping GCP adopters and companies that are using GCP, and this is true for all of for all of the players in the industry, like for AWS, Meta, and for Microsoft, is that we are heavily focused now on helping customers with their AI use cases. Um, in my first year in this hype, like in 2023, I was still in the public sector with the education in the education sector. So the um, the use cases were similar there because the education world has it has a pattern and a certain profile. Now that I'm in a segment where it's more a bigger diversity of companies. So now I deal with companies of all of all types, right? Um, like PMG, and then now these companies have a varying degrees of use cases that are needed, right? It's all sorts of different use cases. However, one thing that I feel like everybody is seeing now, if I were to ask like as a raise of hands, right, who has seen this? I feel like in the last 2 years, everybody has seen this, where we are changing the equation of it's almost like we're overfitting Gen AI for use cases instead of finding the use cases that are appropriate for Gen AI. And a lot of that pressure comes from stakeholders, from investors, because everybody is like, hey, where yeah, we're going through a slide. Sorry, I'm just going through like a long-winded introduction. Um, but what's happening like right now a lot is that the use cases sometimes are not fitting for Gen AI, but because we have so much pressure from investors, from everybody else saying like, hey, where's the Gen AI? How are you disrupting with Gen AI? Where is the ROI for Gen AI? Some of these use cases, and that's why I'm joking that this is we're starting to enter an era of degenerative AI, in which it might not be very helpful, right? So anyway, having said all that, that's why I want to keep this conversation like as fair as possible. If you have any questions about comparisons with other models, or what are some of the best approaches, models, or frameworks to use, or what are the advantages and disadvantages, I want to have like a very honest conversation on all of that. But as a Google representative, I will focus on the Google announcements and what's cutting edge and state of the art as far as the Google research and the Google products, which is at par with the industry. So you're going to see similar things with the other players as well. Okay, having said all that, am I good to start here going through some of these announcements? There's going to be announcements of all sorts of things: Chirp, Imagen, Gemini, Gemma, everything under the umbrella of Gen AI and AI ML ops in general. Now we're going to touch on various little things here. But once again, if you have any questions, if you feel like this is a use case that is a fit for a use case, let me know. Or if you feel like the opposite, like when things are overfitting a use case, and I love using that term because overfitting is a legit problem in machine learning, right? And I think we are seeing overfitting as a business problem when we're trying to overfit use cases that are not necessarily appropriate. All right. Okay, so as you can imagine, there's all sorts of things happening in this world. Vertex on Google Cloud Platform. Vertex is the name that we give for all things AI ML. So anything even beyond Gen AI, right? So when we talk about traditional machine learning, and traditional is kind of crazy to think of like traditional machine learning, right? Because like machine learning has been a thing for only some 15 years, right? 2009 is when GPUs started being used um, for machine learning training and inferences, and when that sort of like when that hype started, we started seeing like such a huge growth of machine learning use cases all over the place, right? From 2009 up until here, Google itself has implemented some form of machine learning in every single one of its products, right? So it's crazy that we're talking a science that's only like maybe 15 years old in practicality. We're talking about that in legacy terms now because generative AI came in and it's seeming like a whole new thing. But it's important to remember that machine learning is an umbrella, and generative AI is within that umbrella. Generative AI is a form of machine learning. There are many other forms of machine learning, just like machine learning is a form of AI. Generative AI is ML, ML is AI, but AI is more than ML and is much more than generative AI. Does that make sense? Okay, so Vertex AI on Google Cloud is where all of the things ML AI are at, including all of the Gen AI stuff. We've been seeing like just a lot of adoption. We have several examples. This one with Snapchat, I don't think it's like that interesting, but anyone who uses Snapchat, you have seen some of their AI stuff, especially on video. There's a little video here there's a little video on Spiegel's like implementation of that. But if you use Snapchat, you can see. This one for Puma is I feel like it's a little bit more interesting because this is like a very specific use case, and I think the more specific the use cases are, the better. Um, and in this case, they're using Imagen 3 for the content creation for generating images, and they've had incredible results and a 10% increase in click-through rate just after they've been using Imagen to localize images very fast, right? So, like for example, they have same pair of shoes, and that lady is sort of like the director of all of the marketing imaging. So if you have like one pair of shoes and you want to display that in a website in India, they're going to use some like local appealing things for that image. And the same thing, like for example, if it's in Brazil, they're going to use like a landscape or like a landmark or something in Sao Paulo for that picture, so that it appeals to the audience. And that already has proven to increase their engagement by a lot. Um, and as you can imagine, right, like the logos, we have like a lot of like big logos as far as customers who are already deploying these at an enterprise level, right? So like production level operations using GenAI and all sorts of things. Okay, so Vertex AI, a quick summary here, right? So we have 1.5 Pro new models and the bigger context window for 1.5 Pro. And we have Chirp here, dynamic share quota. I'll go into that to see, kind of like explain what it is. And we have an integration with YouTube now that's pretty neat. So you pretty much just get a URI from YouTube and you can use that as the input, and you can not only use video as an input, but you can use a streaming channel as an input. And that part is huge. That part, in my opinion, is the future, and I can elaborate more on that. Then we have some functionality. The prompt optimizer is pretty cool. We're gonna go into all of this, like distillation of Gemini is now available out of the box. There's a lot of stuff here, and there's like some grounding and some ML ops that were updated here in, as far as like the last few months, right? Okay, so very quickly on Gemini, what we're calling 002, which is the naming as well for these models, and this is why, like, I want to validate if anyone feels crazy with how the world is right now, especially on these like in this Gen AI whole thing. I don't understand why they say like it's a 1.5002 instead of like 1.6, for example, or 1.51 or 1.52. The naming convention here is just, but at the same time, like naming convention in all of cloud is crazy. But the new version of Gemini 1.5 Flash has come out, and it has a lot of enhancements, right? Math is probably still the biggest challenge in the text Gen AI world, is math and STEM in general, and the bigger context window, all those things that we talked about. This, this idea that we are being very competitive in our pricing is true. It is what all of these players are trying to do. It's like, we're trying to lure usage via efficient pricing. Right now, Gemini is very competitive, especially Flash. Flash can be as much as like 10 times cheaper than Pro, and even Pro compared to some other similar models, price wise, is being very efficient. So this is talking specifically about the context window, because the context window, the 2 million context window, is kind of crazy. It's huge, right? You can think about a 2 million context window, and I've literally done that a few times, where you can input an entire code base, right? You input an entire code base for like a simple app, which maybe like 1 million, 2 million tokens, and then you literally ask the LLM, hey, I have this feature, or I have this story that I'm working on. How would you write this story? Like, what are the files that you would change? And it creates the entire pull request for you, which is kind of cool, right? And at the same time, like, even though I've done that a few times, it's not a silver bullet, right? You still have to go through and make sure and like double check. But the idea that a model can ingest essentially an entire book just as a context is almost like fine tuning on the go, right? These huge context windows is something that we've been betting on for a while, and it's sort of like an industry differential for these models here. Okay, now let's do a bigger deep dive on all of these like announcements. And if there is some questions here that I didn't see, let me know, and I can address the questions if I didn't see it. Okay, so first, just with the YouTube integration, I think this is pretty cool and very convenient. When you're selecting the type of input, directly from that input, you can select YouTube, and you input a YouTube video for the analysis, or for whatever it is that you're trying to extract from that. It obviously makes it easier for us because we are YouTube, so that integration is a little more seamless. Now, the streaming API, this is amazing, right? I don't know if anybody has seen the Gemini demo that Sundar gave. I don't remember if it was next, but earlier this year he gave this demo using Gemini in a constant streaming. So like the user is sort of like filming things around with their cell phone, and Gemini is in like a live fashion, like on demand, answering questions about what's happening in the video, right? So it's like you're walking with the video, and it's like, oh, my coworker is working on something, and then they film the screen. What is it that they're working on? And then Gemini is like, oh, they're using a Python script, and they're writing on a Jupyter notebook or something, and all sorts of context. And then they would show a plan, and it's like, oh, what about this plan? What is this plan? Gemini. But the idea and that's the part that is my vision for the future, right? I feel like in the future we are going to have streaming channels open almost all of the time in the way that we use technology, like either our cell phone or our glasses or our watches. I think they'll be able to scan things via video, and then using that video, you'll be able to extract all sorts of intelligence, or get an assistant to tell you things, or to help you with things based on that streaming of video, which is, in my opinion, also like one of the biggest revolutions of the transformer model, is that the transformer was built more for like a translation use case. They were just trying to like, oh, who can do translation better back in like 2017? Is it recurring neural networks, or what is it? And then the transformer was like, oh no, it's actually pretty easy. Attention is all you need. And that's the fastest way to translate, is using this. And then people realize, oh, actually, there's like a lot more that we can do with this. We can use transformers to generate embeddings. We can use transformers to generate embeddings from videos. and we can make sense of a vector space based on a video or an image a lot faster because of transformers, because of the facility, the how easy it is now to generate these embeddings and then to go look for similarities or whatever it is that we're looking on that vector store. uh, this multimodal capability of transformers, I feel like it's what nobody could have predicted, I guess. And now we're stepping into that future where we can do all things by video. But once again, being fair with the whole degenerative AI, right? Uh, I'm already scared. Sometimes, like my wife is complaining that all of our Google assistants. I'm a Google fanboy, right? So I have Google assistants all over the place. And sometimes, like my wife's already complaining, like, "Oh, is this Google like turning on all the time, or like, is it spying on us, or is it, or sometimes like we're not even talking to it and it's doing stuff." So when we get to that point where streaming has become such an ubiquitous part of how we interact with technology, and that we're constantly streaming video and audio, how does that make us feel when it comes to privacy, when it comes to protection in general of like trusting these technologies, what they're saying, what they're telling us, and how we're interacting with them, right? So once again, like there's always a caveat to all of these like exciting technologies, right? And we're the first to say, oh, this technology is great and look at this is awesome, we're getting to the future, state of the art. But it's also very important to start thinking right away as well, how do we make this safe, how do we make this appropriate, how do we make how do we make this ready to go to market in a way that we're not rushing and not just trying to get ahead and not. Does that make sense? So like these questions I feel like are more important in the long term than the short term pressure from investors and everybody else is like, oh, Gen AI, Gen AI, Gen AI, right? Okay, moving on. Unless there are any questions here. Oh, can you connect Google Assistant with Gemini very soon? So this is the next step. This is a step for Google and all of these players that has been on the horizon ever since this whole hype came about, right? Is how to put these LLMs incorporate them into these assistants, right? Like Alexa, Siri, and all of that. However, these questions that I just brought up, these questions of appropriateness, security, and all of that, they are still very relevant, and that's why some of these things are still like experimental. And Google, for example, is wanting to make sure that this is as safe as possible on the assistant. There is already some Gemini assistant capability that is out there, but the assistant right now on Google is not necessarily Gemini. Okay. Great questions here that I want to go into them, if y'all don't mind. So first on Gemini, right? Gemini, yeah, Gemini. That answer is correct. Is one of the LLMs for Google. It's part of a series of efforts that Google has made into proprietary LLMs. Before Gemini, for example, we had Palm 1 and Palm 2. These proprietary models like GPT-4, GPT-3, and GPT-4, Gemini, and Palm before that, the Claude models. These are humongous models. Humongous models. When Google released Palm, I think it was like 500 billion parameters or something. And so these models, the reason why they're proprietary and the reason why these companies are charging money for them is because it costs literally billions, sometimes trillions of dollars if you take the aggregate of all of that to train these models, right? They're really, really big. And they also use data from all sorts of places, right? Which is another kind of dark aspect of the degenerative AI, is like, where does this data come from? Is all of this data vetted? Is all of this data copyrighted, right? But anyway, Gemini is the latest on the series of Google proprietary models. And it's the latest and sort of like out there as the most powerful, robust, and big. So if you are looking at the top multimodal models in the industry right now, you're gonna see ChatGPT, Gemini, the Anthropic models as like the bigger, more robust, and really competitive like multimodals. However, there are literally now hundreds of models of LLM models, and many of them were sort of like created in the last 2 years. And the idea is that there will be thousands of models available in the future, as more and more players, as more and more people are investing in training models or in using sometimes like smaller models for things. Um, Something that would be um, like on the other side of the spectrum from Gemini would be something like Llama from Meta, which is open source, so it's like free to use, and there's like a little bit more transparency, or at least in theory, more transparency on what type of training data you was used, and they have much smaller models, like 7 billion parameters, compared to like, for example, something like Palm that was 500 billions and it took months to train. Um, what Google has on that side, which I will touch upon a little bit, is Gemma. So Gemma is the open source version of an LLM that Google has made, sort of like to compete in this space where Llama is more. Okay, so the Google CCAI and Google Gemini and Google Vertex. This is an excellent question. And in this presentation, I'm focusing on Vertex AI, right? And Gemini is part of like Vertex AI. Vertex AI has all things AI ML. However, we've had for a long time, even before generative AI, before even before ML in a way, we've had the contact center solutions, and folks who are familiar with Dialogflow, we've had these solutions for forever, and these solutions are very mature when it comes to building agents. So one phrase or one term that people are using a lot now, especially this year, because in this hype cycle there's a lot of things that happened, right? One of them was that, and one person gave a presentation at PMG at a AI meetup a couple of months ago, maybe 2 months ago. She gave an excellent presentation on the agentic centric approach to building with LLMs, right? So instead of thinking like of just like how do I use LLMs, or even the idea of like, oh, I want to build a chatbot, we think beyond that by thinking about building agents and how these agents work together, and we start looking at agents almost like how we look at people, like agents have different personalities, different profiles, different filtering capabilities, or triaging situations in which they'll be put in, and specific roles, right? So when we work with agents now, um, it's a way of abstracting the work around LLMs to create these entities, and these entities being more well defined. The best place to do this is actually not Vertex AI, is on CCAI and Dialogflow. So we have, and we used to have something that there's been so much like reshuffling around our product naming and our name spacing as far as like where do products go. We used to have like agent builders directly on Vertex. Almost all of that has been now sort of like offloaded to the Dialogflow CCAI world, where it makes sense, because these platforms have been building agents for forever, even before GenAI. Now the only thing that's different is that they're incorporating GenAI functionality, like multi-turn conversation with a chatbot, into these agents. So going beyond the idea of a chatbot, it's more like you can think of the chat interface as a feature for interacting with AI agents. And that's where you would go to something like Dialogflow, which Dialogflow will have that flow that's presented there will be similar to that. To explain in very simple terms, it will be very similar to that flow where you have like a caller when you phone like an automated system, and you have that caller saying like, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, or press 3 to talk to a representative. So Dialogflow builds these flows, and now it's heavily incorporated with GenAI functionality. So that so the paradigm of building agents, the best place where you should be is on CCAI and Dialogflow. Yeah, so exactly. So that other question of does Vertex AI to make multi-agent LLM solutions, that will be more on the Dialogflow CCAI side, and these things more are better abstracted now. So it's almost like this: if you are an AI engineer and you are more focused on fine tuning, distilling a model, training, like deploying a fleet of models and endpoints and making comparisons between them, or all of the ML ops associated with AI models in general, then you're going to be living on Vertex. However, if you are more on the product side and you are more focused on the user experience and how you are going to implement all of that LLM, Gen AI, all of that fun stuff, how are you going to actually build that into agents and into a user experience that makes sense, that is appropriate? And if you are more product focused on that sense, maybe less AI ML focused, you will be going to Dialogflow and to CCAI to build those agents, and you will have all of the functionality that's available on Vertex and Gemini and all of that. That's all heavily integrated. In fact, it's all like native now to Dialogflow in a way. But Dialogflow will give you the tools, the interface for that user experience. And this once again brings me back to that point of like, let's not make generative AI degenerative, right? We have the generative AI on that part where they are useful, but when it comes to building agents, we are going beyond just generative AI. We are going more to a user experience type of focus. Okay, so one thing that now, if you are on Vertex AI and you are playing around with these models, anyone who has done this um, has come across quota issues, right? And especially now because there's still so much hype, quota and capacity issues are gonna be a thing for a while. For all of the big techs, the fact, the reason why Nvidia is blowing up so much, and whoever bought $10,000 of Nvidia back in 2020 is a millionaire now. The reason why that is happening is because the world is just running out of GPUs, right? And this entire thing is run by GPUs and TPUs, right? So the capacity at data centers, all Google, everybody else, is like the capacity of data centers is very constrained when it comes to these services. So dynamic share quota makes it a lot easier. It's more dynamic to get quota for like your usage, and it's more adapted to your current usage. However, when it comes to capacity, reserving capacity for something like Gemini, we have something that's called provision throughput. And provision throughput is essentially almost like you buy a slot. You buy a certain amount of Gemini, and then you can use it as much as you want, and you will never face an issue of the data center running out and start giving you 429s because it's out of capacity. Okay, so and now an announcement on Chirp for those who are very excited about the specific models that deal with speech to text. Chirp version 2 is out there, and there's a big focus now on Chirp when it comes to translation, which I'm happy to see, because that was the original intention of the whole transformer thing. It was like to translate, and sometimes I feel like that's almost like obfuscated by all of the multimodal and craziness that we see. But Chirp has incredible capabilities now with translation, with more language support, and more voice profiles. We have actually like hundreds of voice profiles now, that can fit your needs in any way. So, for example, you can think of it sometimes even as far as like accents, right? In Brazil, for example, we have 27 states, right? And we have such a variety of accents depending on what region in Brazil you are. And I would love to see, when we get to the point, we're not there yet when it comes to Portuguese, but when we get to the point where we can have Chirp profiles, for example, emulating all the different accents or the dialects in Portuguese, I'm going to be so happy, right? And these technologies are furthering themselves in such a way that we'll get there soon. Okay. Now let me talk a little bit about Gemma. The announcements on Gemma are a little bit older. They're more from July. Most of these announcements here are from September. They're the I have another AI seminar today that's happening actually right now. I'll see the recording right after this. So the announcements for October and November, the November announcements are like everything that's like super fresh out of the oven. I'll actually find out today, but anything before that, it's what I'm showing you now. The Gemma announcements are more from July, but I wanted to touch on Gemma a little bit, and a little bit on Mistral too. We are big partners with Mistral. Mistral is similar to Llama and to the Anthropic models. We're a big partner with them, and you can deploy them via the model garden as well. But Gemma too. So Gemma is our open source version. We used a lot of the Commons library for the training in Gemma. So it's very open and transparent as far as like what it has ingested. Very lightweight, so you can see something like 9B and 27B versions, and these are the actually the bigger versions. Gemma 1 has a 3B, a 7B version. So the Gemma is very lightweight. Because it's open source, you don't need any type of licensing. You can deploy that endpoint even at the edge. So let's say, for example, that your application requires that the user make inferences offline, which is very common, very, very common. I have, for example, lots of customers now that are on the agriculture side, and it's common that like people who work more like out in the country, they won't have as good internet as everybody else, but they need functionality. For example, one of my customers here in Texas, actually, Frontiers Market, they do a lot of image recognition for cattle, right? And they and a lot of that functionality, if you're not connected to the internet, like all of that is gone, right? So it's very useful to have an LLM, a multimodal LLM that's deployed at the edge, so you can touch upon it completely offline, and it can give you inferences, and it can give you some um, for example, in that case of Frontiers Market, you take a picture of a cow and it gives you the weight, the estimated weight, the breed, and all sorts of things offline, right? Because you're deploying that directly. You deploy that directly at the device level, and because it's like only 3B, 7B, sometimes it can be even cheaper, or it can be very lightweight to deploy that, and it can be cheaper than using something like Gemini Flash. However, I will show you here some things when it comes to um, some implications for deploying Gemma, right? Gemma is estimated that the 27B model, which is the bigger model for Gemma, right? So, like, if you go with the more robust model, you would need at least 4L4s or an A100 or a 2x2 TPU. So because of that infrastructure behind it, like when you deploy open source models, it sounds like you're on your own, right? You provide the infrastructure, you do whatever you want, but at the same time, you don't have to rely on capacity of a data center or quotas or anything like that, right? You can even deploy using your local hardware, but the estimated amount of energy and resources is about an A100. And if you've used an A100, it's like a pretty hefty GPU, right? So it can be expensive in a way. So you could even get away with paying less, being more efficient, just using Gemini Flash out of the box, right? But once again, what's the degenerative potential here, right? I hope Google doesn't fire me for saying that. But how long will Google offer Gemini Flash for cheap? Who knows, right? Um, Gemini Flash is cheap right now because Google is trying to be competitive. Maybe and not for free, right? I said for free, but like for cheap. What if they increase the price of Gemini Flash like in the future, right? Um, what if and this is like, I mean, this is plausible for any of these big models. We don't know exactly how the landscape in the law world regarding AI models is going to change, right? So what if some lawsuits or some country regulations or whatever it is start coming around, where some of these big models like Gemini, ChatGPT, they're essentially banned, right? So there's like a lot of caveats, right? The big techs are always going to say like, hey, use our proprietary models, they're easy, you just pay by token, and we have like a big, at the end of the day, it's an ROI, effort, because like we have spent billions, trillions of dollars training these big models. When you are working with open source, you have full control. You have complete control. When you deploy a model, when you fine tune that model with your own data, it becomes almost like proprietary to you. Nobody else can touch it, or you can even copyright that model, as far as like, this model is my company's, it has my brand and everything else. So I have a strong bias towards open source, and agnostic, right? Because it gives you flexibility, even if it might not be cost efficient all of the time. But those are the trade-offs. Okay, so like moving forward here a little bit faster, we have introduced a lot of like out of the box fine tuning, prompt tuning for these models, especially for the proprietary ones like Gemini. However, we also offer that for our partner models such as Anthropic and Llama, but those are on a vendor by vendor case. And with Llama 3, for example, it is coming up with fine tuning soon. But the prompt tuning is something that's really interesting. So the prompt the prompt optimizing and the tuning of the prompt, it's almost like you have now models helping you to write the prompt for you, right? So if I don't know if you can see the gift on this one is a little bit bigger, right? So when you have a prompt, you go into the prompt optimizer, and now it's almost like you're asking another LLM, how do I prompt the original LLM, which is kind of funny. So it's like as you are typing the prompt, now there's an LLM, like there's an optimizer LLM that's helping you say, hey, this is what you should do for the prompt. Because if you do that for the prompt, here's the result. If you do what you did for the prompt, here's the result. So it's like it's helping you to come up with the best prompts. So you have the best templates, and prompts in a way are almost being treated like a code base, right? You have like a definitive list of prompts that you just change some variables, and the prompt optimizer is helping you to get there to that optimal prompt, right? Let me stop here just for that question here real quick. Which languages are used to build the AI models? Dinesh, is that a question about natural language like English, or are you talking about like what kind of stack as far as like programming languages are used to build the AI models? And the other question, what is the full open source tech stack for a high throughput chatbot using Gemini? Well, so Rakesh, for that question, right? Gemini itself is not open source, right? So like if you're looking for a full open source tech stack, as far as the model itself, I would choose an open source model as well, like Gemma or Llama, and countless others. There are many other models, and some of them can be used more like a base model. Like Gemma is being sold a lot, not sold, but being pitched as a base model that you can fine tune on top of it, right? And then for example, LangChain, even though LangChain is not necessarily an agent builder, but LangChain as a tool for orchestrating LLM efforts is open source, and we even have LangChain managed now on GCP. But LangChain itself is open source. We also have Jupyter Notebooks managed, which we called Collabs, and Jupyter Notebooks is also open source. So I have seen countless demos where a person is in a Jupyter Notebook using LangChain and using Llama, and they're building agents, right? However, when you are using sort of like that more simplistic open source stack, right, of like a Jupyter Notebook and LangChain and open source models, you are still going to incorporate like several other tools to, because once again, the agent design is more of a user experience. It goes beyond just LLMs, right? So you are going to have to incorporate, and there are, now I forgot, but we have like a CCAI sort of like some competitors that are in the open source space, that focus on building those flows for like contact centers and agents, right? But the more agent centric functionality, you will also need to find open source tools for that, because it will go beyond the spectrum of something like LangChain, for example. Dinesh, for programming, it's more, I feel like it's more because like you could essentially train anything just using like a Python, using Python in a Jupyter notebook. You could train anything, right? However, it's more, I feel like it's more the underlying structure stack that is more relevant. Like for example, what vector spaces are you using, right? And that stack includes open source like Neo4j or whatever it is, right? So the embedding strategy, all the vector spaces and the embedding strategies, there's going to be implications on what you choose as a platform for that. And then the ingestion mechanisms, right? As you are training with lots of data, like so these models like Gemini or 4.0 Mini, they took like months to train because it's such a volume of data. So also that data, that the flow of data, right? And I was going to use data flow, because data flow, Apache Beam, those are all open source tools. Data flow is the managed Apache Beam version on GCP, right? But this architecture of how to train a model, it's going to include several stacks, and it's going to like several pieces of that architecture. There's like all the data pipelines, all the ETL of like data coming from here to there for the training. There's all of the model strategy as far as like model when we're talking about databases. So what's gonna be our embedding strategy, and then when it comes to deploying that model as an endpoint, now you have an entire sort of like API gateway strategy as well. So it's like it's a big architecture, but the programming itself for training, you can literally be a few lines of, because it's mostly like um, embed all of this data kind of thing. You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's more like what data you're going to use to train the model. Okay, so awesome. In fact, like this next question here by Steven goes exactly into what we're talking about here, into the fine tuning. Um, this is still the prompt optimizer. So optimizing a prompt, it's actually become a form of fine tuning. Fine tuning became like almost like a loaded word. But fine tuning the prompt and giving huge context as far as the context window and few shot, all of these are being called sometimes like fine tuning, as like a form of like training an LLM, right? But when it comes to like supervised fine tuning, which is the more traditional form of fine tuning that we know in machine learning, Gemini 1.5 now allows for that out of the box. So like if you want to fine tune Gemini, then you use the pipeline that's in Vertex to do that, right? When it comes to something like Gemma, um, you can do essentially that. You can download it, and then once you download it or like you deploy it somewhere else, like even locally, you can do whatever you want with it. Like you can start doing all sorts of things with it. With something like Gemini, it wasn't possible before because Gemini is a private endpoint that's owned by Google. Now Google has released the endpoints and the functionality around fine tuning Gemini, even though it's proprietary. But what happens is that they give a Gemini endpoint to your tenant, and then that Gemini endpoint becomes like almost like part of your project. And once you start fine tuning it, it becomes proprietary to yours. Nobody else would have access to that fine tuned version of Gemini. When it comes to something like Jamma or Llama, then the sky is the limit as far as like what you could do to train it. And for GPT-4 is the same case as Gemini, because GPT-4 is a private endpoint. They restrict or they regulate how much and how you can fine tune it. And one of the caveats for that, at least for GPT, is that they charge some fees for the fine tuning specifically. The way that we are charging for fine tuning here, as this bullet says here, only pay for the training compute, is that we're not paying a fee, we're not charging a fee for the fine tuning. We're just charging the compute behind it. So whatever you use for fine tuning, it will be just the tokens that you used that you will be charged for. Okay. What should we use? What should we be using for sentence encoding in ML models? Still universal sentence encoder or now Gemma? That's a good question, because now this goes into the embedding strategies, right? That you're gonna choose, and you can have, and you're gonna have multiple options, right? Um, Gemma, I would have to look it up, but I think Gemma uses the universal encoder, so it's not necessarily like multiple mutually exclusive. But I can look up on that a little bit more, especially if you want to reach out to me later. Just let me know. Okay. So let me go back here to the next few slides. Okay, so supervised fine tuning now available on Gemini. It's also available for several other partner models out of the box if you don't want to have to do the ML ops yourself. Like Gemma, for example, you can deploy Gemma via the Model Garden, and the Model Garden itself will give you the endpoint for fine tuning it, like the Anthropic models and some of the Llama models and the Mistral models as well. Not all models have that in the Model Garden. Sometimes you'll deploy a model like from whoever in the Model Garden, and you won't see any pipelines for fine tuning, which pretty much means you would have to do it yourself. And now there's distillation as well. Distillation is considered almost like it's a form of fine tuning as well, but it's almost like the opposite of fine tuning. Instead of like adding more data in, it's almost like you're taking data out. You want it to be more focused, right? So distillation is more like making a very knowledgeable big model and transforming that into like it would be like a distilled version of that bigger model. So it's like it's smaller, but it retains all of the relevant knowledge for that task. For example, you can think of, even though this is not necessarily correct, you can think of Gemini 1.5 Flash or GPT-4 Mini as a distilled version of the bigger parent models. So one thing that you can do now with Gemini, and you use, and under the hood they're using Gemma for that, is that you can distill Gemini 1.5 Pro with a training data set into a smaller Gemma model to make it more lightweight, and that's out of the box as well, which is pretty interesting if that's a need if that's a need of yours to have like smaller models and to have them distilled for efficiency. That's pretty cool. Okay, and then the evaluation service. There's a lot here to the evaluation service that's out of the box on Vertex and uses the SDK. There's all sorts of like metrics and scoring to evaluate the output, right? Um, okay, so Gemini is also we have a more flexibility on the format of the output, and you can be explicit on that. Before you used to say like, oh, bring me the output in a JSON format, and you wouldn't. Sometimes you would hallucinate, but now you can literally just say, hey, I need the output to be on JSON, and it will be on JSON. Okay, so some updates on Imagen 3. Imagen 3 is now available. Imagen 3 is pretty powerful. Just like some examples here, right? Functionality that wasn't there before, like adding items to an image, to an existing image. So like there is an image, and then you just want to say, oh, add this to the image. Or customize, like change the color or add something to the object. All of these things like used to not be there before. This is the one straight from the Puma use case, where they put different backgrounds for locality. Another thing too is that Imagen lets you select the output size and aspect ratio, which is big as well in this space. Okay, so agent builder. Now back kind of like back on that, like agent functionality, right? Which a lot of that you have to start going to platforms like CCAI and Dialogflow. But the ability to ground, there's a really cool demo of grounding with Google Search, which is, if you think about it, it's like it's what we should always be doing, right? It's like if you don't have enough data to ground it, you should at least ground it with Google Search. And now that's out of the box. You can always have the Google search for the input be associated with the response, which means that the LLM will just wrap the response that it comes from Google with it will just wrap that with natural language, but you will be sure that you got the right response, which is this functionality here, like the grounding with Google search. And it's now all before you would have to do all of this like orchestration in something like LangChain to make this happen. Now it's just out of the box. And all of this, like this is all within the world of RAG. And I've done like entire presentations on RAG, but the grounding aspect of LLMs, and that's where it's going more into the agent knowledge, right? Grounding is here to stay, and having some form of grounding strategy is like imperative for agent building in general, right? And grounding, a big thing of grounding is really just data, right? So where is that data? Is that data in Salesforce? Like where do we go to get that data? And all of these connectors are making it easier now to ground data on wherever the data is at, right? Image annotation. There's a lot of the releases that have been around preparing data. So like the way that we prepare data to be ingested and fine-tuned, these LLMs are helping a lot with that as well. Function calling. I don't know if anybody has played around with function calling at this point, but function calling is one of like my favorite things, right? And it's very similar to how we've been developing with services, right? Like you build your fleet of services, and you make them as decoupled and as abstract as possible, and then you just call those APIs, right? However, the LLMs are sort of like making that more convenient, where so long as the LLM has visibility to the services that it can call, you can ask the LLM itself to make the decision on what functions to call, which once again, very much focused on the agent approach, right? So the LLM is more part of an agent, and that agent has a fleet of services that it can call upon to go call for information, right? So like one of the demos that we built, we had services doing all sorts of things. One service was looking for the availability of the restaurant, and the other was looking for like types of restaurants like around town, and the other was looking like for whatever dietary restrictions each restaurant. And then once you have once you have a question or like a prompt for that agent, the agent knows which of these services to call to procure the answer. I'm not going to go through this demo here. I can finish here real quick with enterprise readiness on uh, mainly compliance, right? Like you can think of like uh, uh, things like the GDPR, and Canada also has data residency restriction. Google has a commitment that the and this commitment is more than a commitment, because like we are going through audits and we provide like the all of the compliance requirements for all of our products, right? And we have like a very comprehensive detailed list of everything that's compliant with what. Um, but a lot of these regulations, they say the data cannot leave, like for example Canada, data cannot leave Canada. So it means that everything that's processed by the ML service needs to stay within Canada. And we have made several announcements on expanding some of these regions, on the compliance and the commitment that we have with the ML services in these regions, that the data will never leave. And in general, making it appropriate, making it ready for production wide type of deployments, enterprise type of deployments. And the last bullet point here is just that the model garden is kind of like it's kind of like uh, Hugging Face in a way. And what's the name of the other one that's also ours? Kaggle. It's like Hugging Face and Kaggle had a baby, and that's the model garden. So you have all of these vetted models, open source, third party, proprietary from Google, and you can deploy and do all sorts of things with them. But there is all sorts of like mechanisms now, or organization wide mechanisms to like govern all of that, all of these models, right? So you have models that maybe only one part of the organization can use, or they can be used only for this and that, and they can't. For example, if we go back to that compliance thing, right? Maybe our clientele in Canada, we can only use X and Y Z models because they are the ones that are compliant with that region, right? So that governance and that organization wide view of all of these models, there's like new mechanisms now in Vertex AI to manage all that. And that's a wrap as far as like the announcements and the things that are fresh out of the oven from Google and Vertex AI. Let me see. Let me see if there's like any questions here that I didn't. Should we build uh, should we build many functions which an agent can call, or should we give it info to build its own function and execute it? Great question. So both, right? So the more you are, the more specific you are in building these functions. So like, let's say we have just like a cloud function with a list of services, and they're all well named and everything else, the better, right? But you can play around, and that's the beauty of LLMs, right? You can play around with tuples, so you can have like a function that pretty much like takes other functions, and that is very modular in the sense that the LLM itself can sort of draft a function to go there. Most of the time in function calling, the LLM is drafting the parameters. So the LLM is coming up with the parameters by itself and calling the functions, understanding how to call them. But you can do that sort of like injection of functions as tuples into like other functions. Especially I'm thinking now, like if we're playing with Swift or some of these languages, I don't even know if people use Swift anymore, but you could start going crazy with that kind of like loops of creating functions on the go. And then there's another question here. Let's see. Can I use Gemini to detect network intrusion and threats? Absolutely. Great question. Great question. And it's funny because like nobody wants to think about security, right? That's always like the boring thing. It's like, oh, security. Absolutely. In fact, all of our security tools have implemented all sorts of generative AI now, right? But going beyond generative AI, inference based threat detection is the way to go. Is like it has always been the way to go because it's instant, right? When it comes to threat detection, we have to detect it right as it's happening, because like if we give it a second, it will cause damage, right? So the beauty of machine learning is that it can make inferences in a split second, right? So the use cases that are around security are fascinating to me. At the same time, you now have now it created this whole paradigm now for the threats, the threats itself, right? So now we have more sophisticated bots, and you have persistent bots that use LLMs and they don't give up, and they keep trying to like penetrate or attack or steal stuff. And it's, in a way, the LLMs is also degenerative in the sense that it's creating all sorts of fancy viruses, and it's making us have to step up as far as like how we defend and detect them. Does Okay, so let me try to go through the questions here, and I'm sorry we're going over time a little. The question: does the YouTube URL feature need to access the video transcript to work or not? It seems most video summarizers need access to the transcript to work instead of reviewing the actual video itself. Good question. My guess is no. I haven't. This is a feature that I haven't tested myself yet. So this is a good question, and Brian, if you wanna get back with me on that, I want to test that out. My guess is no, because a lot of the transcript happens via ML models, right? And Gen AI is one of the big use cases for Gen AI as well, is the generation of transcripts. So my guess is no, but I also will guess that videos that have a vetted transcript will work better, because then it reduces the chances for hallucination, because the YouTube can generate the transcript for you, which anybody who has done that will see that it makes mistakes. But when the user provides the transcript, which is an option, right? When the user edits and provides like a vetted transcript, then that significantly reduces the work that the LLM is doing as far as that video goes. So my bet is that transcribed videos that are vetted are better, but I think it will still work even if the video doesn't have an official transcription. All right, thank you everybody for coming. And I know this is like a lot of announcements, but in a way, it's to put it in perspective on how crazy this industry is right now. Um, but you know, it is an exciting industry. I'm sure. I'm hoping that you can find, fancy use cases to use Gen AI, and always be careful with the degenerative potential of these technologies. So there's always a balance to things. And my email at Google is giz@google.com. So I'll put it in here. So if anybody wants to reach out, feel free. And thank you all for coming and participating. I love the questions.
Thank you, Gizmo. Thank you for sharing your expertise on generative AI. And I hope everybody has enjoyed the session and gained some insights. I can see so many questions they have asked. So I have opened the I have opened your mics. I have allowed you all to unmute yourself and ask more questions if you want to ask. And also, please take a moment to fill the survey. The survey is really important for us. Please tell us, how did you find this event? How did you find this session? Did you find it informative? Please fill the survey. I've shared the link in a group chat. So please take a moment to fill this. Anybody who would like to ask anything?
I'll put my email here again, or I can also put. Is can you all still see my screen? So I put my email here in this last slide here. Giz@google.com.
And also, you can ping your LinkedIn IDs in a group so that we all can connect with each other.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, let me see. That one I always forget. It's probably my given name, which is hard to type, but oh no, Gizmo Bentim. Okay, not that bad. Yeah, LangChain is definitely used widely in production. In fact, I would say that LangChain is probably the de facto orchestrator for 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 LLMs today, right? Even the fact that it's open source, like don't let it mislead you that it's open source, that it's not enterprise or production ready. In fact, it's so popular that that's the reason why we have managed LangChain now, which is a recent announcement as well. I think that was Q3 that LangChain is now managed on the Vertex AI. It is by far probably like the top choice for orchestrating LLMs.
All right. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you. Bye bye.